the key components? What are the key components that will ensure that you have a case once the matter goes to court? So the legal elements of fraud are: one, it is a material and false statement. So either falsification of accounts, falsification of documents, and any other records of the company. So it's material and it's false. The second thing is that knowledge, the perpetrator had knowledge that the statement was false when it was uttered. So it's not a mistake. Sometimes organizations can lose money through just deliberate mistakes of employees. But this is not a mistake. This is actually done with intent. So that's the other component in proving fraud. The next one is reliance on the false statement by the victim. So the perpetrator knows that when they're uttering this false statement, when they're falsifying these records, somebody, the victim, is going to rely on them, okay, and they're going to make a decision on the basis of that. And that's the element of deceit. And then the last one is damages which result from the victim's reliance on the false statement. And here you can see there doesn't necessarily need to be a gain for the fraudster, okay, but there has to be some sort of damage, whether it's reputational damage, whether it's financial damage, or any other sort of damage. So these are the key elements to prove fraud in a court of law. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about fraud and why we need to talk about fraud in organizations. As we know, if we don't know how to talk about fraud, first thing is we will not recognize it in our daily operations. If we don't know fraud, we can't recognize it. Even if it's staring us in the face, we won't know this is fraud. So you really need to understand what fraud looks like in your organization and in the various departments and units and processes that your organization detects. And if you don't know fraud, again, you won't be able to prevent it when you're designing processes, because you only know where to put doors and windows and how to lock those doors and windows if you know that that's the loophole that the fraudster is going to use. But if you don't have any idea of what loopholes are, then you won't include that in your design process. And then finally, if you don't understand fraud, you don't know fraud, how are you going to detect it when you perform control tasks? So you can see, without proper knowledge, and this is for everybody. So when we talked about in the past webinars, we talked about the 3 lines of defense. So really every single person in the first line, the second line, as well as the third line, they need to understand what is fraud, and they have to be able to talk about fraud within their departments, within their organizations. But why is it difficult? I mean, the first thing is that no one likes to talk about fraud. There's a big reluctance to discuss fraud in organizations. And the first thing is it's about stigma and perception. Fraud, as we know, it's normally associated with negative connotations. And many organizations, they fear the potential damage to their reputation if they openly discussed fraud or fraudulent activities. There's a reluctance to admit vulnerability. So, you don't want to say to people, oh, we may have issues, we may have controls, we may have gaps, or even wrongdoing. So there's a reluctance, even if there's something that goes wrong, organizations may not want to admit it, and this can hinder open communication. The other aspect about not liking to talk about fraud is the fear of panic. Organizations may worry that discussing fraud openly could create panic among stakeholders, including your customers, your employees, and investors. And this fear may lead them to downplay or avoid addressing you, even when transparency is essential. And then the next point is, like the ostrich burying its head in the sand, we don't really know how to talk about fraud. There's a lack of communication skills regarding fraud. And there are 2 elements to this. First of all, there's the complexity of the topic itself. As we know, fraud can be a complex and multifaceted issue. It can involve legal, technical, and ethical dimensions. Many individuals in an organization, they will lack the necessary communication skills to be able to articulate these complexities clearly and concisely to their diverse audiences. And then the second issue is a limited understanding. In some cases, individuals responsible for communication may have a limited understanding of the intricacies of fraud. And this can result in ineffective or no communication at all, and a failure to convey the severity of the issue or the organization's commitment to addressing such an issue. And then the last one really is, we all have business targets, we all have more important and more pressing things, and it's focused on our business target and goals. Well, nothing wrong with that, but it's a question of prioritization of objectives. We all live in a fast-paced business environment. Organizations often prioritize achieving financial targets and strategic goals, and then other things, can be neglected. For example, addressing potential risks, including the risk of fraud, until they become crises. And then there's also the issue of long-term versus short-term perspective. Many organizations, if not most, they focus on short-term gains. It's about this year's profit. It's about this year's return. And discussions about fraud prevention and mitigation might be perceived as detracting from immediate business goals. However, as we all know, neglecting fraud prevention can have long-term consequences. And overcoming these is not really that difficult. I mean, with a culture of openness, you can basically, where fraud is not viewed as a taboo, people will start talking about it. Also, you need to invest in communication training. And then you need to integrate fraud awareness into business goals. But I mean, here are some of the here are some of the reasons why we should learn to talk about fraud. The first one is preserving trust and reputation. Open communication about fraud demonstrates transparency and a commitment to integrity. This can help preserve the trust that customers, our clients, our investors, and other stakeholders have in the organization. Also, maintaining a positive reputation is essential if you're going to attract and retain your customers, your clients, and other business partners. So if you're transparent about how you address fraud, you can mitigate reputational damage when it happens. The other aspect is legal and regulatory compliance. Legal and regulatory authorities, as we know, often require organizations to disclose instances of fraud. And failure to comply with these requirements can result in severe penalties, fines, and even legal consequences. On the other hand, openly discussing fraud incidences and demonstrating a commitment to rectifying issues can positively influence regulatory perceptions and outcomes if and when a fraud actually happens. Then the other aspect is internal control and prevention. Encouraging open dialogue about fraud within an organization, this fosters a culture of accountability and vigilance. Employees are more likely to report suspicious activities, and this can aid early detection and prevention. And also communication about fraud policies, their reporting mechanisms, and consequences for fraudulent activities. This will serve as a deterrent, and it reinforces the importance of ethical behavior within the organization. Then there's the element of risk management. Recognizing and openly addressing fraud risks will allow organizations to develop robust risk management strategies. By understanding your potential vulnerabilities, you can implement preventive measures and you can strengthen your internal controls. Goes without saying. Also, communication about fraud risk helps stakeholders, including investors and insurers, to assess the organization's risk profile accurately, and therefore, engage the organization, okay, in a much more positive and strong manner. And then there's obviously crisis preparedness. In the event of a fraud incident, your company is prepared to manage the crisis effectively. This will include having a well thought out communication plan to address various stakeholders promptly. And just remember, being proactive in communicating during a crisis can help your organization regain control of the narrative and demonstrate a commitment to resolving the issue. And underpinning all of this is need not be said, but there you go, it's ethical leadership. Transparent communication about fraud is a clear demonstration of ethical leadership. It sets a standard for ethical behavior within your organization, and it positively influences the behavior of employees and other leaders. And then we also know ethical behavior is increasingly valued by our consumers, our investors, and other organizations that prioritize ethics. These are more likely to attract and retain stakeholders. Now, what I want to do is just share some insights from the report to the nations on occupational fraud. This is a report that's done by ACFE, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They've been doing these reports annually since 1996. And what they do is they investigate real cases. So in this particular case, people like myself will contribute without names, obviously, and with complete confidentiality, okay, the issues that are relevant for the report. So the findings are based on 2,000 real cases of fraud which affected organizations in 133 countries and in 23 industries. So it's a real representation of fraud in your industry as well as in our region. Let's look at the global cost of fraud. Yeah, like I said, 2,110 cases from 133 countries, causing total losses of more than 3.6 billion. So these are the losses to those organizations, okay, where people participated in the survey and then reported what was the extent of actual loss that was identified. There might be some loss that was not quantified because not every investigation will unearth all the fraud. But you can see that the ACFE estimate that organizations lose at least 5% of their revenue to fraud each year. And the projected loss is $4.7 trillion to fraud globally. So that's a huge, huge number. If you think about it, that's bigger than many countries. And then if you look at the average loss per case in dollars, it's nearly $1.8 million. So that's not a small amount. That sort of loss, some organizations will not sustain such a large hit. And you can see that more than 20% of cases that were investigated had losses of over $1 million. So basically what it means is you've got to have your systems to detect the fraud at the earliest. And the quicker you take action, the more decisive your action, the smaller is going to be your fraud loss. If we look at the main categories of occupational fraud, there are really three main categories, and we've talked about this over and over again, but I'll go through them again. There's asset misappropriation, there's financial statement fraud, and then there's corruption. And you can see the losses from asset misappropriation, which is the most common fraud. The losses are probably the smallest, $100,000, but 86% of all the cases that we investigated were of this nature. And then corruption was prevalent in 50% of all the cases. So whether this is bribery, whether it's kickbacks, whether it's extortion, and how much of that do we experience daily, in East Africa? So yeah, as you can see, it's a major problem. And then the third element is financial statement fraud, where there was 9% of all the cases out of the 2,000 cases where this was the problem. But when this happens, the fraud is much bigger. And in this case, you can see it's nearly $600,000. for one instance of fraud. The other thing about knowing how to talk about fraud and learning how to talk about fraud is this taxonomy. We really must understand this taxonomy. This here is basically, it talks about what kinds of corruption there is. So you have conflicts of interest, you have purchasing schemes, sales schemes, bribery, invoice kickbacks, bid rigging, illegal gratuities, economic extortion, and so on and so forth. And then you've got on the other side completely financial statement fraud. And this is basically either trying to inflate or deflate your income, or inflate or deflate your expenses. That's what this is, to try and show a better picture or a worse picture. Some people will be trying to avoid taxes. Some people will be trying to avoid withdrawal of funds from stakeholders. So they will try and show a rosier picture. And others will just cover their fraudulent tracks by manipulating financial statements. And then right in the middle, in the dark blue, is asset misappropriation. And as you can see, there are as many frauds as there are probably people in the world. So yeah, and different fraud schemes coming up every single day. And what we're saying is, in your organization, you need to be aware of how fraud will look. When it manifests itself, what is it going to look like? What are the red flags? This is the minimum knowledge that you and your employees in all the lines of defense, you need this knowledge. The duration of fraud versus financial loss here, you can see basically that the longer a fraud remains undetected, the greater is the financial loss. And you can see that on average, there's a loss of $8,300 per month of fraud going undetected. And typical frauds will last for 12 months. But then you can see on that chart, okay, on the long bars towards the right, some frauds will even go on for more than 5 years. And when that happens, and they're not detected, then the average loss is $800,000. So you can see how that steep graph goes up, the longer fraud remains undetected. And how is it detected? So here we're looking at the most common ways that fraud is detected. And again, we've talked about this before. The biggest way is through tips by employees or by customers or anonymously, or through your vendors, or sometimes even through your shareholders, or if you're really lucky, even through your competitors. Even they can report fraud in your organization. And then the next most powerful is obviously your internal audit. So ensure that they're well trained, ensure you're not cutting corners in terms of the staff that you employ, because remember, this is the guy, this is your last line of defense. If this guy fails, if your first line of defense fails and your second line of defense fails, then this guy, okay, is your last line of defense. So don't cut corners when you're hiring internal audit. Obviously, you shouldn't be cutting corners for any staff, but you can see why this is important, because this really is your last line of defense. And then, of course, you can also spot fraud from management reviews, from document examinations, from account reconciliations, from transaction monitoring and data monitoring. And I think more and more now, through continuous auditing, especially now with AI, with machine learning, you're finding that more and more organizations are including continuous auditing within their processes, and are actually detecting trends for fraud much earlier than they would if they had not been doing that. So before I hand over to my colleague here, let me just put in perspective what we're going to discuss. So I have basically been talking about why we need to talk about fraud. And this is all on the prevention side, right? Now, my colleague, Roger, who's coming on next, is going to be talking about, once the fraud has happened, how do we respond, right? And this is really important, because how we respond, how effectively we respond, is going to determine the mitigation, basically, how much loss your company suffers, whether there's any reputational risk, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to do is, over the next half an hour or so, we will delve into how we can create effective incident response plans, the importance of forming cross-functional teams, the importance of preserving crucial evidence, and the art of launching controlled investigations. And then beyond that, we're also going to look at some strategic methodologies which are indispensable when you navigate the aftermath of a fraud. So, what I'll do is, without further ado, let me hand over to my colleague, Roger. Roger, if you can now share your screen and take our participants through the rest of the webinar. Are you there, Roger?
Left it. Hi, sorry about that. We have a slight technical issue. We'll be back soon. Sorry about that. In a few minutes, Roger will be back to take us over how to detect fraud and like what to do after fraud detection occurs. So just give us a few more minutes and we'll be back. Thank you for your patience.
Hi everyone, sorry for that technical hit. I think we're back now. So as I said, I'll just take you through quickly some of the steps that you should take immediately after detecting fraud in your organization. So the first step is obviously internal investigation. So as Zahir mentioned, so the statistics on the duration of fraud and financial loss. Fraud detection requires a rapid response because the longer a fraud takes before it's detected, the greater the financial loss your organization will experience. So you need to have an immediate response. And the first step of doing this is having an incident response team. So some of the steps on doing this is you form an incident response team. You select the leader. So you can designate a very seasoned executive officer, such as the chief financial officer or the chief risk officer, or even the chief internal auditor, to spearhead the team and the decision-making processes. You also have to make sure to assemble a senior and cross-functional team. This should include financial experts for monetary evaluation, legal advisors for compliance, IT specialists for data forensics, and communication professionals for efficient stakeholder management. So this team needs to be very diverse to ensure a very comprehensive and unbiased approach to fraud response. You also have to make sure that this team is independent from the department, ensure that the incident response team is very independent from the department where the fraud occurred, so that you ensure that there are no conflicts of interest when the investigation is ongoing. And this is very crucial, to make sure that the assessment is done objectively. And then you also have to define very clear roles and responsibilities for this team. The second immediate step that you should take is a risk assessment. So you should initiate, of course, leading from the incident response team, should initiate a very comprehensive risk assessment to be able to understand the scope of the fraud, the potential financial losses that you may have been exposed to, some of the legal implications, and reputational damage that the organization may have been exposed to. This also helps to establish secure communication channels to ensure that you know who can be informed of the ongoing case, and use encrypted platforms through this to prevent any information leaks. The third is engaging legal counsel. So involving legal counsel early is a very key step to navigate any potential legal repercussions that may come up, during the investigation, and also guide the organization's response to make sure that it is within the legal boundaries. So assessing the necessity of also involving law enforcement is also crucial, based on the severity of the fraud, and consulting your legal counsel, specifically in-house legal, if the organization has that, is essential to make informed decisions. Then the next key step, immediate step to take, is to document the incident. You should maintain a very detailed incident log that captures all the actions, decisions, and communications that have been done, and it should be updated in real time to make sure that it is accurate. This also helps to preserve the evidence. You should instruct the incident response team to meticulously preserve all the evidence that is related to the fraud, whether it is digital or physical, and document the chain of custody to make sure that it is relevant in case of any legal proceedings. And you look at some of the key steps on how you can do this. It's also important for this team to develop a very chronological timeline to outline when the fraud was detected, the initial response actions that were taken, and any subsequent developments that were done. This timeline will serve as a very critical reference point for investigators and for legal proceedings if we were to go there. The next key step to take is to contain the issue. So after establishing the response team, you should make sure to isolate and contain the issue to prevent any further damage to the organization, secure the affected systems. This also helps to preserve the evidence and minimize potential impact on the organization. So some of the steps to do this is: one, you isolate the affected system. So if it is a digital system, you revoke network access and disable any compromised accounts. For non-digital fraud, like inventory theft, for example, you can physically secure in storage facilities the files, anything necessary, any form of evidence that where the fraud happened, and limit access to these files. Then you collect and preserve the evidence. So you collect any necessary evidence that is related to the fraud. You can capture screenshots, log activities, physically secure files or documents, and put them in a separate control room, and maintain a very meticulous chain of custody for each transfer. This is also a very key step because it is the bedrock of investigations and any potential legal action. And then the chain of custody that we've said adds credibility to the evidence and ensures that it can stand any legal proceedings should the investigation take that course. The third is to identify the compromised accounts and assess financial impact. So you can utilize forensic techniques to trace the financial transactions that are related to the fraud and identify any compromised accounts. You can also engage financial experts to conduct a very comprehensive assessment to ensure that they consider both direct losses and even broader organizational consequences. This is a very key step because it is pivotal for understanding the scope of the fraud And this assessment also guides recovery efforts, and informs and informs decision making regarding the resource allocation. The next key step is to implement access controls. So you should swiftly implement role-based access controls. Remember when you talked about the incident response team, these are the people who should be able to access the evidence. And you're going to do this by adjusting user permissions and privileges and the access cards that we mentioned. This is a very key step, to make sure that the evidence does not disappear, that some of the things that are related to the fraud don't disappear, and now you can be able to investigate. And the last thing is to engage internal audit or an external investigator. So you should be able to establish a very clear communication channels with internal audit, because internal audit can do an independent investigation and provide them with a brief and all relevant information, such as the timeline, the evidence that we talked about, and the access to the evidence. Engaging an external investigator is also a very key step. And let's look at some of the key reasons why this is a very critical step. So the first is an external investigator will offer, such as ourselves, will offer expertise and objectivity. An external investigator will bring very specialized skills, such as skills in forensic accounting, digital forensics, and even investigative techniques that may not be available within staff in the organization, like the internal audit, for example. External investigators also provide a very unbiased perspective because they are free from the internal influences of the organization or any conflicts of interest. And this objectivity will create credibility throughout the investigation and ensure that the work is done very thoroughly. They also provide very industry-specific knowledge that allows them to understand some of the nuances of the business environment that is relevant to your organization and be able to detect fraud patterns that are unique to your sector. The second thing is they ensure ethical and legal adherences or considerations. External investigators, such as ourselves, are usually well versed in legal and regulatory requirements, ensuring that findings and evidence collected can withstand the court process should the process go there. They also adhere to very ethical standards during the investigation to ensure that it is done with integrity and in compliance with the ethical guidelines. The third key advantage is resource efficiency. External investigators usually can dedicate very focused resources to the organization, a very specific team that comes to do the investigation. And this allows for a very quick and efficient process, which of course is faster in compared to utilizing internal resources that may have other responsibilities. These investigators or this team can also be deployed very rapidly, to ensure that the response to the fraud is done timely and you can minimize any further damage. They also provide an independent perspective because they may uncover issues that may not be initially apparent to the personnel, to the internal personnel, and they offer a very fresh perspective that can reveal any hidden aspects of the suspected fraud. The fifth key point is confidentiality assurance. So when you take on reputable investigators, they're very experienced in handling sensitive information and often will sign NDA agreements to ensure that your reputation and your integrity is preserved, within the market, and ensure that the work or the findings of the investigation stay confidential. They're not leaked, into the media or the business team. The sixth key point is an efficient utilization of technology. So investigators who are external usually have access to advanced forensic tools and technologies such as for computer imaging, forensic imaging, digital forensics, and such. And this ensures that they're able to collect and analyze digital evidence very efficiently. And they can even uncover evidence that is deleted, or evidence that is hidden. The next is comprehensive reporting. So we're usually very skilled in producing very confidential, comprehensive and professional reports. Our reports are usually factual findings reports that usually detail the key factual findings, the conclusions, the recommendations, and the exhibits and appendices that are attached to that. And we'll provide a detailed method on we'll have a detailed section on discussing this particular issue. And the last thing is risk mitigation. So external investigators usually assist in identifying and mitigating risks that are usually associated with this fraud. And this helps organizations implement preventative measures to avoid any future occurrences of the fraud. So let's go along to some of the key steps when engaging a forensic investigator. Just a reminder, as Me had shared, it's here. If you have any questions, feel free to include them in the Q&A section, and we'll answer them towards the end. So when your organization is confronted with fraud, so, and as we discussed, an external investigator will bring a level of impartiality and expertise that is very essential for a thorough investigation. But there are usually some very key steps that you should take to be able to engage this investigator in an efficient and even resource-freeing manner. So the first is scoping the investigation. So you should be able to identify the suspected fraud area. You can pinpoint some of the transactions that are suspected, the individuals that you suspect, or even the departments that you'd like to be scrutinized. So this is a very key step, because focusing on a specific fraud area will allow the investigators to direct their efforts efficiently and ensure that a thorough examination of the relevant transactions and individuals is done. This is, of course, a very key step, because it will minimize any unnecessary disruptions to the non-involved parties, and it will accelerate the investigation process. If a whistleblower report is available, you should also consider sharing pertinent details with them. This is after signing an NDA. You can be able to share the whistleblower's report, and this enhances the investigator's understanding of the context and of the specific allegations. And this will allow them to be able to target their resources to the areas that are suspected, and this will, of course, help with efficiency and even with the cost, because it will streamline the investigation process and allow them to prioritize their work. So the second key step is to define the terms of reference. So you should be able to carefully define the engagement terms. This is the scope that we've mentioned, the expected timeline, the reporting mechanisms, that you'd like. It's a progress update report, the final factual findings report. You also specify whether you want a forensic investigation. This is whether the investigation you want, you would like it to go the full way up to the court process, or you'd like just a special audit or an internal investigation that is just for you to identify the fraud and mitigate it. This is a very key step. It's a very key thing to define before you engage this investigator. The third key thing is to decide on the suspects. So usually with fraud, if there is a whistleblower's report or a suspicion, you will also have suspects, people who you suspect to be the perpetrators of the fraud. And it is a very key step to evaluate whether it is necessary to suspend them or retain them during the investigation. And you have to collaborate with your HR or with your internal legal counsel to make informed decisions on this. And we look at some of the key considerations for this in the subsequent slide. The fourth step is to ensure very timely information sharing. So you need to, once you have engaged the investigator, provide all necessary information promptly. This will include the timeline that we have mentioned, the evidence that we have mentioned, the whistleblower's report, and any other relevant documents or access to systems to aid the investigation. This is very critical because it allows the investigation to be done effectively and thoroughly. Then you also need to ensure staff collaboration. So you need to collaborate very closely with the forensic investigators to ensure that your staff are usually will collaborate in sharing information, in providing consultations and interrogations, that are necessary to understand the business context. Usually with such investigations, staff are usually afraid, they prefer staying out of the investigator's way, or not wanting to be known because they don't want to be, caught out, whether in case they circumvented some controls or even were part of the fraud. But from the response team, and from the management, they need to very clearly communicate that staff need to collaborate with these investigators, because it allows them to understand the nuances, the documents that you have, filing system, for example, and any other relevant documentation and information regarding the organization. And this is, of course, held by your staff. So you need to ensure that you can facilitate interviews or consultations with the staff and coordinate any of such to make sure that information is passed on very efficiently. Then the next step is to do a very prompt review of the final report. So you need to be able to look at the final report that they provide. Even before that, you can look at the interim updates. You should be able to receive. Investigators such as ourselves usually provide our clients with regular progress update reports as we go along with the investigation. This is to keep the client aware of what is going on, anything that may come up, and allow them to make decisions. So you should be able to review this and get any information that you require from this. Also, promptly review the final report, to ensure that the investigators have covered everything that you require, and also to ensure that you are aware of the issues that have been identified. Because usually with forensic investigations, not only will they uncover some of the fraud and losses that have been exposed, they will also uncover some of the controls that were circumvented or were not present, and that caused the fraud. So a prompt review of this report is key, because it will allow you to be able to make the key decisions after this and stop any future forms of fraud. And the last thing is to decide on the next steps. So you need to be able to evaluate the findings and the recommendations and decide on the appropriate actions that your organization should take, whether it is pursuing criminal charges or initiating internal disciplinary measures, or even filing a lawsuit with a service provider. It's a very key step in ensuring that in engaging the external investigator. So as I had mentioned, let's look at some of the considerations for detaining or suspending suspects through the investigation. It's a very key decision because suspects through the investigation are the people who you, as we had said, people who you suspect to have caused the fraud. And some of the considerations include: one, if you suspend the suspect, it allows for evidence preservation. So if, say, I am the perpetrator, and I know I have committed the fraud, and there are forensic investigators that have come to the organization to investigate. So of course, I wouldn't want to be caught. So the first thing I would do, I would immediately delete or destroy any of the evidence that is necessary to the fraud, cover my tracks to make sure that I'm not caught out, So it's a very key step in, if you suspend, the suspect, it's a very key step, to make sure that they don't do that, so you preserve the evidence, and this will ensure the preservation of the integrity of the investigation and any manipulation of any crucial evidence. Suspending them will also prevent interference. So as individuals implicated in the fraud usually interfere with the fraud, they try to distract the forensic auditors, they try to delay information requests, providing of information. So suspending them, will prevent such interference and create a controlled environment where evidence collection and analysis is done efficiently. And of course, this will also reduce the likelihood of attempts to conceal or alter any facts of the fraud. Another consideration to take is whether you want to protect your organizational interest. So organizations may choose to suspend the person to safeguard their interests, particularly when there's alleged misconduct. The misconduct has the potential to significantly impact their reputation, operations, or financial standing of the organization. And this is a key step, especially for perpetrators who are in high areas, people who are in key management. So it's a very key step to protect your organizational interest. Suspending them will also minimize any business disruptions. So in cases where the suspect, as I mentioned, holds a very key role within the organization, suspension may be necessary, to make sure that there is no business disruption. And this will ensure the continuity of operations and prevent the individual from influencing any critical processes during the investigation. Again, for organizations that are exposed to the media, this is a key step because it ensures public perception and trust. I'm sure you've seen cases of fraud investigations where if the company is very well known, the first thing that the company will do is suspend their director, the CEO, their CFO, or whoever is necessary to investigate the fraud. And the reason they do this is it enhances the public perception and trust, because suspending suspects who are involved in very high-profile positions demonstrates a key commitment to accountability, which will, of course, positively influence external stakeholders' perception of the organization. And the last thing that this does is prevent collusion. So if multiple individuals are implicated in the fraud, then suspending suspects will prevent them colluding to either alter evidence, destroy, or delete the evidence. And this will, of course, disrupt any collaboration between them and ensure that each person's involvement is assessed independently. So throughout this process, your organization needs to be able to collaborate with HR and legal. It's a critical facet in the decision-making process, in determining whether to suspend or retain the suspect during the fraud investigation. So let's look at how we can do this. So the first thing is balancing the rights. So balancing the rights of the suspect is a key area because it involves ensuring fair treatment throughout the suspension process. So this includes providing access to legal representation, adhering to any established policies and procedures or the code of conduct, and upholding the principle of innocent until proven guilty. This balancing of rights is also crucial because when you collaborate with legal and HR, it avoids any unlawful actions during the suspension. So for instance, it prevents defamation or protects the privacy rights of the person and ensures that the organization acts within the bounds of the law. And the last thing that this does is it ensures that there are ethical considerations, in the decision-making process of whether to suspend or retain the suspect. Because I'm sure the last thing that an organization would want is an investigation that cannot stand because they did not include or did not refer to the rights of the individual during the investigation. So legal consultation is also a very key step because it ensures compliance with employment laws and guarantees that the decision will align with any local and international employment laws. Legal professionals also provide guidance on the legal parameters, of employee suspension and protect the organization from any legal ramifications. When you consult with your legal team, it also allows them to have a thorough review of the employment contracts, that is conducted in collaboration with the legal. This ensures that the suspension process aligns with the terms outlined in the individual's contract, preventing any potential breaches or legal disputes, after. And legal professionals also assess the legal implications of the suspension, This may include any potential claims of wrongful termination or violation of employment rights. And we've seen such cases where organizations suspend the suspect, and immediately after they're hit back, with a suit, on wrongful termination or violation of rights. And I'm sure this is the last thing that any organization wants, because it impedes the decision-making process of the investigators as well. And so you need to be able to consult with your legal team. And the last thing is you also need to be able to consult with your HR professional. So when you collaborate with HR, it ensures that the suspension process aligns with the internal organizational policies. HR professionals are usually able to provide key insights into company-specific procedures, and this will, of course, facilitate a very consistent and fair approach. HR professionals also usually play a very crucial role in upholding the rights of employees, and this will ensure that due process is followed in the suspension, and that the rights of the suspects are respected throughout the investigation. Making sure that even the suspect feels like they were treated fairly, regardless of the allegations against them. And HR professionals are also a very key step, because they take the lead in communicating with the suspended employees, so they can provide them with information on the reasons of the suspension, the expected duration, and any additional steps that are involved. And this clear communication minimizes any uncertainty and maintains the transparency of the investigation. So now back to conducting a comprehensive investigation. So after you have detected occupational fraud, you need to be able to do a very comprehensive and meticulous investigation to be able to uncover the full extent of wrongdoing and facilitate informed decision-making by your management. So there are 8 key steps in doing this. I'll just go through them quickly. The first is to plan the investigation. And these are the steps that can be taken by the incident response team, the internal auditor who is doing the investigation, and this is the steps that even us as external investigators usually take. So first thing is we usually plan the investigation. So we clearly articulate the purpose of the investigation, the objectives, the scope of the review that you have provided for us through the terms of reference, and the methodology that we follow. So we will collaborate with key stakeholders, legal counsel, and any relevant departments to be able to establish a very collective understanding of the organization's boundaries and their goals. We also allocate our resources strategically. So this encompasses personnel, technology, and any budgetary requirements that are necessary to ensure that your investigation is very adequately equipped to meet its objectives. The allocation of process involves usually selecting the personnel that have the relevant skills and expertise needed specific to the investigation. The third thing we do is we develop a detailed timeline with key milestones for the investigation. We provide a roadmap for the investigation's progression. So we usually set realistic timelines to ensure that there's a structured and efficient process and enable the team to track progress and adapt as needed. The second thing we do is data collection. So data collection, as we said, is a very key step in the investigation process. So we gather all necessary information. We usually employ a variety of tools, such as digital forensics or manual data gathering, depending on the specific fraud. This is a very inclusive approach to ensure that there's comprehensive acquisition of all relevant information. So digital tools will be able to capture any electronic evidence, and manual methods, such as sending requests for information, collecting files, and all necessary evidence will cover any non-digital aspects. We also implement strict protocols for preserving digital evidence. This is usually one, following a detailed chain of custody, and two, if it is digital evidence, we collect a forensic image of the digital device, to be able to preserve timestamps and ensure that the evidence is collected in a manner that can withstand the court process. And then when applicable, we usually establish a secure platform for collaborating with the whistleblower. So we usually do an initial whistleblower interview to gather all the necessary facts and their testimony, and we provide them with a consultation note to sign against that. And we collaborate with the whistleblower throughout the investigation to make sure that if there are any key areas that need to be looked at, they have been covered. The next thing that we do is process walkthroughs, system walkthroughs, consultations, and interviews. So we usually conduct very comprehensive walkthroughs of any relevant processes and systems. We come to the organization and our aim is to understand the workflow, any potential vulnerabilities, the very specific nuances of how your system and your people are set up, and we gain insights to your operations. So when you're able to visualize this process, it aids us in uncovering any potential weaknesses that may have been exploited. We also do consultations with the key personnel. So we gather insights and perspectives that are necessary, within the context. So we're able to leverage the expertise, of the key personnel. So if it's a very specific system that your organization uses, we're able to consult them and gather their expertise in how to extract the specific data that we want during the investigation. Once we're able to identify the specific findings and the allegations, we also conduct forensic interviews. So we usually utilize specialized techniques to extract accurate and reliable information that can withstand court process. The next thing we employ is data analysis and forensic techniques. So we usually utilize forensic accounting, to trace the financial transactions and uncover any discrepancies and quantify the impact of the fraud. We also usually scrutinize the financial records and reconcile accounts to make sure that we account for all the funds that we have been sent to look after. We also do comparative analysis, to identify any anomalies and irregularities in your data sets and understand, whether there was fraud in this area. We also do the forensic imaging and analysis for digital evidence that we have seen. The fifth step that we take is documenting the case. So as I had mentioned before, for a forensic report to be able to withstand the court process, you need to have a very meticulous method of documenting the case and any evidence that is collected. Because if you collect evidence in the wrong way, then you may go to court and find that the evidence cannot withstand. So the first thing we do is maintain a meticulous chain of custody. So for any evidence that you give us, we have a detailed chain of custody that is kept very well to make sure that we are able to see who provided what information, when and how, and show that how the information was handled and stored by ourselves and how it went back. This is a very transparent and verifiable trail, an audit trail that can be checked by anyone. We also compile a very comprehensive case file that encompasses all the relevant documentation, evidence, findings, and such and such. And this serves as a detailed reference for, the whole investigation and any legal proceedings that may follow after. And as I said, we also include all the exhibits and appendices. We collect all of them in the documentation to provide any supplementary details and support our findings. The sixth thing is we do our factual findings report. So we normally present a very clear and concise factual findings report that indicates all the areas that were looked at, the factual findings that were identified, and the conclusions that are concluded from the findings, and the recommendations that we'll talk about after. So we're able to draw very clear conclusions based on the evidence gathered and articulate the outcomes of the investigation. We also are able to summarize the financial losses that are exposed by the organization and the individuals that are involved in the fraudulent activities. So we're able to provide a detailed account of each person's extent of involvement and ensure that there's a comprehensive understanding of the impact of fraud. This will help your stakeholders, that is the key management, the board, audit committee, and such, to be able to fully grasp the consequences of the fraud. We also provide recommendations So recommendations are usually provided in three key ways. So the first is the actions to be taken against the perpetrators. So we normally propose specific actions that can be taken against the perpetrators of the fraud. This may be summary dismissal, or if necessary, we will recommend criminal or civil lawsuits, also depending on what your organization will prefer, after collaborating with your legal and your HR. Will provide a recommendation that is appropriate. The second thing is we provide recommendations of the internal controls that need to be remediated. So as I had said, as a forensic investigation is ongoing, it not only uncovers the fraud, but also the internal controls that were exposed or that were not present or that were circumvented. So we're able to offer detailed recommendations on remediating the weaknesses in these internal controls, and also provide a roadmap for the organization to strengthen these controls. This may include any preventative measures that may mitigate any future risks of the fraud. The third thing is we usually provide a risk rating on the recommendations, the department responsible, and the action timing. So when we assign risk ratings to identified issues accompanied by the detailed descriptions, it helps prioritize the remediation efforts. So you're able to focus your efforts on the key high risk areas that were exposed, going along, and you're able to clearly establish who is going to implement these recommendations and when they're going to be done. The eighth thing that we normally now do, that is, we help the management or board level decisions. So as I said, the board needs to be able to make a decision on whether they will dismiss the perpetrator or do any form of discipline or any criminal or civil suit. So we're able to provide recommendations for the management to make this decision. We also work with your legal team. So if your team decides to file a suit, we, at a different engagement, will work with your legal team to be able to act as expert witnesses when necessary, in the legal process in court. And so the last thing that I'd like us to talk about is strengthening internal controls to prevent fraud. So as you had said, we have now talked about what fraud is and how fraud is detected, and the forensic investigation process. And the last thing is now some of the controls that you need to be able to implement to detect fraud. And we usually refer to the internal Institute of Internal Auditors 3 lines of defense model that we're showing here. So the first line of defense is the governing body. So the governing body should establish first, very clear anti-fraud policies and mandates. So they should be able to outline the expectations for any ethical conduct and for their organization's commitment to fraud prevention. They also provide a very strategic risk oversight that is embedded in the broader risk management strategy of the organization, ensuring that this governing body actively assesses and addresses the potential fraud risks as part of organizational objectives. The third key thing that the governing body does is stakeholder communication. So they usually they're meant to maintain very transparent communication with stakeholders and articulate their commitment to robust fraud prevention. The second line of defense is usually management. And so management has some very key steps in risk management. So the first is the control framework. So the management should conduct a very comprehensive fraud risk assessment. This should be done to identify and evaluate any potential vulnerabilities across the organization. They should also strengthen policies and procedures, to ensure that these documents evolve in response to the emerging fraud risks and they're effectively communicated throughout the organization. Management should also develop targeted training initiatives for employees to emphasize their role in fraud prevention, provide guidance on recognizing red flags, any reporting mechanisms, and the importance of collective culture of awareness. Management is also the key line of defense in implementing controls and segregation of duties. So the segregation of duties usually prevents any conflicts of interest and collusion that usually cause fraud. And access controls are usually very necessary to make sure that only the relevant personnel who requires specific information can access that. And this should be implemented by management. Management should also implement multi-level approval workflows. So approval for any transaction should be done not just by one person or two persons, it could be by three persons, to make sure that the approval is done by at least two or three people, to make sure that no one person has control over an entire process. The third line of defense is internal audit. So internal auditors usually provide an independent assurance. They can conduct fraud-focused internal audits, that usually focus on fraud prevention. They evaluate the existing controls, some of the monitoring mechanisms, and even governance structures. And then they provide the recommendations for any enhancements based on their findings. Internal auditors can also look at the effectiveness of whistleblower mechanisms, such as the hotlines and tips, which I think Zahira talked about as the number one way in which fraud is detected. And they also are able to validate the responsiveness of the organization to these whistleblower reports. And throughout this process, you should be able to work the three lines of defense, normally work with external assurance providers. So external assurance providers, such as ourselves, will offer very key things that can help the organization to implement all of these internal controls. For instance, BDO usually offers training programs such as this, where we train the employees on the latest fraud risks, any prevention strategies, and the importance of their role in maintaining a vigilant organization. We also provide independent reviews of any anti-fraud controls that you have implemented in your organization. This will offer a very unbiased perspective on their effectiveness and will also help you recommend improvements where necessary. BDO will also can conduct very comprehensive fraud risk assessments. So these are usually company-wide assessments that assess and identify, prioritize, and mitigate any potential fraud risks or vulnerabilities to your organization. So by harmonizing the efforts of all these three lines of defense and these controls, the organization can forge a very dynamic defense against fraud and make sure that fraud is first quickly detected, and two, thoroughly investigated, and three, promptly prevented, to make sure that your organization is not exposed to fraud and does not become one of the statistics. So I think because of time, we'll just end there. So as a quick summary, we have looked at today the introduction to occupational fraud, some of the case studies of these and how fraud is done. We've looked at the relationship between the duration of fraud and the financial loss. We've looked at how fraud is detected and the immediate response steps for internal investigation. We've also looked at some of the steps to isolate and contain the issue, steps when engaging an external investigator and how you should do it. We've looked at some of the considerations for either retaining or suspending suspects. And we've looked at some of the ways in which a comprehensive investigation can be done and the three lines of defense model for strengthening internal controls. And I think with that, we can end there. So if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to share them in the Q&A section and we can look at them right now.
Thank you, Rajan and Zahir, for a very insightful webinar. We did have one question. The question is, list any types of forensic tools.
Some of the forensic tools that we usually use will depend on the specific fraud area. But to mention one example, if it is a digital investigation, we usually use paraben or paladin for conducting a forensic image, for collecting a forensic image of the suspect device. And we utilize autopsy sleuth kit or in-case forensics, for analyzing this image of the suspect's computer. These tools usually give us all the contents of the suspect's computer, including any deleted data, and they can help us to identify any instances where the fraud was done.
Thank you, Roger. I think that's all for the questions that we have. I just wanted to remind you all about the next week's webinars. We have started a new webinar series on corporate finance, and it's going to be on 6th December, and it's going to be about the general overview of deal process and preparation phase. And I hope you all can make it. And additionally, we have a lot more webinars coming up next year, and you'll all get email reminders. And additionally, you'll get the recording of this webinar on YouTube. All our previous recordings have been uploaded and you can officially view them. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you all next week.